Two of America's top nuclear scientists were screaming at each other on the airport tarmac. One said the hydrogen bubble was about to explode. The other said he was crazy. President Carter's helicopter was 5 minutes away, and the man caught in the middle, a $50,000 a year government bureaucrat named Harold Denton, had to decide what to tell the leader of the free world. This is the story of how an obscure regulator from small-town North Carolina became the most trusted man in America during the worst nuclear crisis in the nation's history. How a kid who swept floors to pay for college ended up briefing presidents, calming 2 million terrified citizens, and proving that sometimes the right person for an impossible job is someone nobody has ever heard of. But before Harold Denton could become a hero, 3 Mile Island had to fall apart. March 28th, 1979. 4 in the morning, the 3 Mile Island unit, 2 nuclear reactor, was humming along at 97% power, feeding electricity into Pennsylvania's grid. Craig Faust and Edward Frederick, both former Navy nuclear submarine operators, were settling into what they expected to be a routine overnight shift in the control room. Their supervisor Bill Zhu was making rounds. Everything seemed normal. 11 hours earlier, a maintenance crew had been trying to unclog a water filter with compressed air. Condensate polisher number 7. One of 8 sophisticated filters designed to strip minerals from the water feeding the steam generators. Routine problem. Standard fix. Except on this night, the blockage wouldn't budge. The crew gave up and left the filter partially obstructed. A minor issue, barely worth mentioning. Then the stuck resin broke loose. The water hammer hit like an explosion. Faust and Frederick felt the control room floor shudder beneath their feet. Out in the auxiliary building, pipes jumped 3 feet into the air. Within seconds, the entire building was filled with scalding water and steam. The feed water pumps had tripped, all of them. Simultaneously, the reactor scrammed automatically. Control rods dropped into the core, stopping the nuclear fission reaction. Emergency systems kicked in exactly as designed. Everything was working, except for one thing. A pressure relief valve on top of the pressurizer had opened when pressure spiked. Normal operation, the valve was designed to open when pressure exceeded limits, then close when pressure dropped back to normal. 13 seconds into the accident, with pressure falling rapidly, the valve should have sealed shut. It didn't. The pilot-operated relief valve was stuck wide open. Steam and water were pouring out of the primary coolant system at roughly 1,000 gallons per minute. A loss-of-coolant accident. The nightmare scenario every nuclear operator trained to prevent. What made this failure particularly tragic was that it wasn't unprecedented. The Khomeini Commission would later discover that this same type of valve had failed on 11 previous occasions at other nuclear plants. 9 times it had stuck in the open position, exactly like at 3 Mile Island. Even more disturbing, the entire sequence of events at 3 Mile Island had been duplicated 18 months earlier at another Babcock and Wilcox reactor, the Davis-Besse nuclear power station in Ohio. The only differences were that the operators at Davis-Besse identified the valve failure after 20 minutes instead of 80, and their reactor was operating at 9% power instead of 97. Babcock and Wilcox engineers recognized the problem. but the company failed to clearly notify its customers of the valve issue. The memo that could have warned 3 Mile Island's operators was never sent. But here's what transformed this mechanical failure into catastrophe. The indicator light in the control room showed that electrical power to the valve had shut off. Standard design. When power cuts off, operators assume the valve has closed. Frederick and Faust looked at the indicator light. It showed closed. They believed it. Why wouldn't they? The light had never lied before. Meanwhile, hidden from their view, from their instruments, from every gauge and alarm in that control room, 32,000 gallons of reactor coolant would escape through that stuck valve over the next 2 hours and 22 minutes. 1/3 of the reactor's entire capacity. Gone. But the operators had no way of knowing. Over 100 alarms were screaming, bells ringing, lights flashing, a cacophony of warnings that told them everything was wrong, but nothing about what to do about it. Craig Faust would later testify before the President's Commission. His words were blunt. "I would have liked to have thrown away the alarm panel. It wasn't giving us any useful information." The operators made decisions that seemed completely rational given what their instruments were telling them. They shut down the high-pressure injection system because the pressurizer water level was rising. They didn't want the system to go solid. What they couldn't know was that the rising water level was an illusion. As coolant poured out through the stuck valve, the remaining water was getting hotter. Hotter water creates steam. Steam expands. The water level was rising not because there was too much water, but because the water was boiling. In reality, the reactor core was being uncovered. By 6:15 in the morning, the water level had dropped below the top of the fuel rods. The 12-foot-tall fuel assemblies were only half covered with water. The core was exposed. Temperatures climbed past 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods began to react with superheated steam, producing hydrogen gas and releasing radioactive debris into the primary coolant. The shields around the fuel rods were destroyed by the intense, rising heat. Metal turned to liquid. Roughly 52% of the uranium fuel melted into a molten mass at the bottom of the reactor vessel. 20 tons of uranium flowed to the bottom of the pressure vessel, coming within 30 to 45 minutes of breaching the 5-inch thick steel wall. If that had happened, if the molten core had burned through the reactor vessel, the radioactive mass would have dropped onto the concrete floor of the containment building. The resulting steam explosion could have breached containment and released catastrophic amounts of radiation across Pennsylvania and beyond. The China Syndrome. The nightmare scenario that Hollywood had just put on movie screens 12 days earlier. It was happening for real. Meanwhile, radiation levels inside the plant were spiking. By 6:30, technicians monitoring readings saw the numbers climbing dangerously. Workers in the control room had to wear protective masks because of the radiation levels. At 6:50, a site emergency was declared. By 7:24, it was upgraded to a general emergency, the highest level, indicating the possibility of radiation release beyond the plant boundary. The worst nuclear accident in American history was underway, and nobody in charge understood what was happening. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Harold Ray Denton was going about his normal Wednesday routine. director of the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a career bureaucrat with nearly 2 decades of experience in nuclear safety. Sandy-haired, soft-spoken, with a slight southern drawl that put people at ease. Denton had grown up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Small town. His father drove a bread delivery truck. His mother died when he was young. At North Carolina State University, he studied nuclear engineering and paid his tuition by sweeping floors and tutoring the football team. After graduating in 1958, he worked at a DuPont nuclear facility in South Carolina before joining the Atomic Energy Commission in 1963. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He was not the kind of person anyone expected to become the most trusted man in America. Just 1 week before the accident, Denton had watched The China Syndrome with his wife Lucinda, the Hollywood thriller about a nuclear plant accident. When a technician played by Jack Lemmon looked at a gauge in the film, Denton casually remarked to his wife, "That's a faulty reading." Now, a real faulty reading was destroying a real reactor in Pennsylvania. The first reports reaching Washington were confusing and contradictory. Metropolitan Edison, the utility company that owned 3 Mile Island, was downplaying the situation. A feed water pump problem. The plant is shut down. No danger to the public. At 8:25 that morning, the first public word of the accident came from WKBO radio in Harrisburg. Dave Edwards, the station's traffic reporter, had been monitoring his CB radio. Police and firefighters were mobilizing in Middletown. That was odd. Then he noticed something else. No steam coming from 3 Mile Island's cooling towers. He contacted Mike Pintek, WKBO's news director. Pintek called the plant directly. Somehow he got connected to a control room operator. "I can't talk now," the operator said. "We've got a problem." Pintek was transferred to a Metropolitan Edison communications manager in Reading, 70 kilometers away. "There was a problem with a feed water pump," the manager said. "The plant is shut down. We're working on it. There's no danger off-site, no danger to the general public." That wasn't true. Radiation monitors were detecting elevated levels. Contaminated water was spreading through the auxiliary building. Something was very wrong. But Metropolitan Edison wasn't telling anyone the full story. Perhaps because they didn't understand it themselves. By Thursday, March 29th, the situation was deteriorating. The NRC's Emergency Management Center was struggling to get accurate information from the plant. Telephone lines were overburdened. Communications between 3 Mile Island and Washington were fragmentary at best. NRC Chairman Joseph Hendry would later admit that he and Pennsylvania Governor Richard Thornburgh were operating almost totally in the blind. His information is ambiguous. Mine is non-existent. Governor Thornburgh was facing an impossible situation. He had inherited evacuation plans that were almost useless. One would have sent residents of 2 counties racing toward each other across a bridge. He feared setting off public hysteria, but by Friday morning he felt he had no choice. A helicopter monitoring radiation near the plant had detected a reading of 1200 milliroom. The federal guideline was 25. Thornburgh issued his advisory. Pregnant women and preschool children within 5 miles of the plant should evacuate. 23 schools in the area were ordered to close. The announcement unleashed a wave of panic. Residents tossed belongings into their cars and fled. More than 140,000 people would eventually evacuate on their own. And then things got worse. Roger Matson was one of the NRC's most experienced engineers, considered the nation's leading expert on emergency core cooling. He had been analyzing streams of data from the control room, and he was horrified by what he found. A hydrogen gas bubble had formed above the reactor core inside the pressure vessel. Hydrogen was created when superheated steam reacted with the zirconium cladding on the fuel rods at temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees. The chemical reaction was simple. Zirconium plus water yields zirconium dioxide plus hydrogen gas. At the extreme temperatures inside the uncovered core, this reaction happened rapidly, generating large volumes of hydrogen. Some of that hydrogen had already caused problems. Early Wednesday afternoon, on the first day of the accident, hydrogen that had accumulated in the containment building had ignited. Operators recalled hearing a whooshing sound. The pressure spike was recorded at 28 pounds per square inch. Doors were reportedly blown off their hinges. The control room shook. Metropolitan Edison had monitoring equipment that recorded this pressure spike immediately. They didn't notify the NRC about what had happened until 2 days later. Now, more hydrogen was accumulating. A bubble, growing inside the reactor pressure vessel itself, and Matson believed it could explode. Speaking to NRC Chairman Hendry, Matson explained the nightmare scenario. They can't get rid of the bubble. They have tried cycling and pressurizing and depressurizing. They have tried natural convection. They have been on forced circulation. They have steamed out the pressurizer. They have liquefied out the pressurizer. The bubble stays. Matson told Hendry they were involved in a horse race, and he was quite unsure as to whether they could win it. That night, Walter Cronkite delivered the news to America, the most trusted voice in broadcasting, speaking words that would terrify a nation. The world has never known a day quite like today. It faced the considerable uncertainties and dangers of the worst nuclear power plant accident of the atomic age. And the horror tonight is that it could get much worse. The potential is there for the ultimate risk of meltdown at 3 Mile Island. Panic was spreading, not just in Pennsylvania. Around the world, thousands of demonstrators in Europe marched under the slogan, "We all live in Pennsylvania." The nuclear industry was watching everything it had built begin to crumble. Public trust was evaporating by the hour. Back in Pennsylvania, ordinary people were making impossible decisions. Nancy McKay of Etters, expecting a baby in 6 weeks, took her 2-year-old son to visit relatives 15 miles away. "At least I won't be 2 miles away," she said. "I don't know anybody that lives any further." Andrea Hand, also pregnant, took her children all the way to Connecticut. "It's fear," she told reporters. Schools emptied. Businesses closed. Gas stations ran out of fuel as families fled. Hotels for 100 miles were packed. The roads leading away from Harrisburg were clogged with traffic. An estimated 200,000 people eventually left the area, though only pregnant women and small children had been officially advised to evacuate. Gene Schenck, a reporter covering the accident, summarized the growing perception. There was a feeling that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was in bed with plant operators. Not just this plant, but all plant operators. The NRC wasn't a regulatory commission. It was a promotional agency. President Jimmy Carter knew he had to act. Carter was not an ordinary politician when it came to nuclear power. He had trained as a nuclear engineer in the Navy under the legendary Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy. He had served aboard submarines and studied nuclear physics at Union College in New York. In 1952, Carter had personally helped dismantle a damaged reactor at the Chalk River plant in Ontario, Canada. The reactor had suffered a partial meltdown. Carter led a contingent of 22 fellow submariners in the dangerous cleanup. Each team member was lowered into the reactor in turn to work for no more than 90 seconds before hitting their maximum radiation exposure. Carter took his turn, receiving in those 90 seconds the full dose of radiation permitted for an entire year. His urine was radioactive for 6 months afterward. He later joked about it, but the experience gave him a visceral understanding of nuclear danger that few politicians possessed. Carter understood nuclear reactors. He understood the risks. He understood the physics of what was happening inside that pressure vessel. And he understood that the American people were on the verge of mass panic. The nation needed someone on the ground who could cut through the confusion and tell the truth. He called the NRC with a simple demand. I want someone on the ground at 3 Mile Island immediately who can report back to me on exactly what is going on. The answer from the NRE was succinct. Mr. President, his name is Harold Denton. On Friday, March 30th, Harold Denton boarded a White House helicopter and flew to Harrisburg. He brought a small team with him, including Victor Stello, one of his most trusted technical advisors. When they landed, Denton found the situation even worse than he had imagined. Absolute chaos. That's how he described it later. The utility company couldn't tell him what was happening inside the reactor. The NRC's own people on site had conflicting information. State officials were making decisions based on incomplete and often inaccurate data. The press corps was angry and frustrated, getting contradictory statements from every official they interviewed. Denton established a direct phone line to the White House. He brought in nearly 100 scientists to examine the facility. He began holding regular press conferences, something no NRC official had ever done during a crisis. His first formal news conference was Friday night. A reporter asked the crucial question, "Has a situation similar to this ever been dealt with before? Do you know what you are doing?" Denton answered honestly, "Well, I think we know what we are doing, yes, but we have never had such extensive fuel damage in the life of any reactor." He added that the hydrogen bubble and the escape of radiation from the containment building were also unexpected. These were the 3 most dangerous developments to occur at 3 Mile Island, and Denton admitted he hadn't predicted any of them. But his calm demeanor and constant optimism were as reassuring as his frankness was refreshing. The reporters believed him. One journalist murmured to a colleague after Denton visited the Capitol newsroom to clarify a confusing report. "He's disarmingly frank. He can probably be believed that the bubble is stable." From that moment on, Harold Denton dominated the coverage. Only the color stories continued to quote local residents who felt they weren't getting the truth. The reporters, at last, felt they were. And something remarkable happened. People believed him. Lieutenant Governor William Scranton III was in the governor's office when he got the call that Denton had arrived. The governor turned to me and said, "Bill, go outside and bring him in." And I walked out and opened the door, and he stepped in and he said, "Hi, I'm Harold Denton." And I said, "Hi, I'm Bill Scranton." But the minute he said, "Hi, I'm Harold Denton." You know, sometimes you have this feeling about people. It just was. This is the right guy. Reporter Mike Pintek of WKBO Radio saw Denton on television for the first time that Friday. He's kind of this slow-talking, southern-sounding kind of guy who automatically puts you at ease and makes you feel more comfortable and safe. That's kind of how it felt. Finally, someone is here that we can trust. What made Denton different? He wasn't flashy. He wasn't a politician trying to spin the situation. He was a quiet, unassuming, intelligent man who happened to know more about nuclear reactors than almost anyone in the country. He explained complex technical issues in plain English without talking down to people. When he didn't know something, he said so. When the news was bad, he delivered it honestly. Dr. Holly Angelique, a professor of community psychology at Penn State, who later studied Denton's leadership, discovered more than 200 letters that people had sent him during the crisis. The handwritten notes are a window into another time, she said. They praised his calm, his honesty, his professionalism. The words trust, truth, and pray came up again and again, as did calm, cool, honest, and knowledgeable. One letter read, "My nights have been spent much more restful, knowing you are in command. Your warm smile, gentle manner, but firm and knowledgeable control has been a pillar of strength. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." People saw him as a savior and a rock star, Angelique said. He made a connection with people on both sides of the aisle, the anti-nuclear people, the nuclear folks. They all felt like he was telling the truth. But Denton's greatest test was still coming. Saturday, March 31st. The hydrogen bubble was still there, and Roger Matson's calculations were getting more alarming. He believed that oxygen was building up inside the pressure vessel through a process called radiolysis, where radiation splits water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. If enough oxygen accumulated, the hydrogen bubble could ignite, or explode. Matson's team of consultants, including experts from national laboratories and Navy reactor programs, were telling him the plant could become explosive within days, maybe sooner. Victor Stello disagreed. He had been working through the night, consulting with chemistry experts around the country. His view was that there was no chance for an explosion. The physics didn't support it. Pressurized water reactors routinely have free hydrogens circulating in the coolant. The conditions for an explosive mixture simply weren't present. Two of the NRC's top technical experts, both highly respected, both absolutely certain they were right, and both reaching completely opposite conclusions about whether Pennsylvania was about to experience a nuclear catastrophe. On Saturday night, the debate was raging. Word was leaking to the press that the bubble might explode. The fear, anxiety, and hysteria about the hydrogen bubble was as thick as pea soup. Denton recalled later, "It was really an anxious time." Then came the call from the White House. The president wanted to visit 3 Mile Island on Sunday. Is it safe? It was Denton's call to make. If he said no, the president would stay away, and the public would assume the worst. If he said yes and something went wrong, the President of the United States could be exposed to a nuclear disaster, along with his wife Rosalyn, who insisted on accompanying him. Denton said yes, it was safe. Sunday morning, April 1st. Victor Stello went to Mass. He was exhausted, having worked through the night, trying to prove Matson wrong. During the service, a Roman Catholic priest offered general absolution, This is a sacrament reserved when death is imminent. While Stello attended church, Roger Matson raced to Harrisburg. He set off from Washington, determined to reach 3 Mile Island before the president arrived. He had to warn them. The bubble was dangerous. Maybe immediately dangerous. At the airport, Matson found Denton and Stello waiting to greet the president's helicopter. What happened next has become one of the most dramatic moments in the history of nuclear power. Mike Gray, screenwriter of The China Syndrome and author of The Warning Accident at 3 Mile Island, described the scene. Here comes Roger Matson into the hangar, and here's Victor Stello, the other top NRC expert. And Stello says, "Matson, you son of a bitch. How could you be spreading these rumors around about this hydrogen bubble?" And Matson is saying, "Victor, that bubble is ready to explode, and if you can't see that, you're crazy." And they're screaming back and forth at each other inside this hangar. Harold Denton stood between them, the president's deputy on site, his 2 top technical experts at each other's throats over whether the plant was about to blow up. And the President of the United States was minutes away from landing. This had to be a fairly thrilling moment for Harold Denton, Gray observed. Here is the president, the chief executive, due to arrive at any moment with his wife. And here are his 2 top technical experts slugging it out in the hangar over whether or not this place was about to blow up. What did Denton do? He told the truth. When President Carter landed, Denton briefed him on the bubble and the possibility of an explosive mixture. "I tried to give him the 2 sides that were out there," Denton recalled, "but we still didn't have a single view on that." Carter, the trained nuclear engineer, understood the situation immediately. He also understood what his visit meant to a terrified public. He put on the yellow protective booties that everyone wore inside the contaminated facility. He boarded a bus with Governor Thornburgh. He walked into the control room of a nuclear plant that might or might not explode. The people of Middletown lined the streets to watch the presidential motorcade pass. And they stood there, and they cheered as he went by, one witness recalled, because he was with them. Inside the facility, Carter toured the control room. James Floyd, supervisor of Unit 2 operations, explained the situation. The president examined the instruments that had lied to the operators, the alarm panels that had screamed useless warnings, the gauges that had shown impossible readings. He understood all of it, perhaps better than anyone else in the room. When they finished the tour, something happened that nearly stopped Denton's heart. At the gate, leaving the facility, the president read his dosimeter, the device that measured radiation exposure. It was reading 78 millirem. "Oh my God," Denton recalled, thinking. What has happened here? The federal exposure limit for the general public was much lower than that. Had the President of the United States just received a dangerous dose of radiation during his reassurance visit? Had Denton made a catastrophic mistake in saying it was safe? It turned out to be a false alarm. The dosimeter had malfunctioned. Carter's actual exposure was minimal. But for those few seconds, Harold Denton experienced the full weight of the responsibility he had accepted. The president's safety had been in his hands, and he had nearly failed. Later that Sunday afternoon, while Carter was still at the plant, Victor Stello finally found the proof he needed. He discovered that Matson and his team had been using the wrong formula to calculate the risk. They had made an error in the rate of oxygen production. The hydrogen bubble was not going to explode. Dan Martin, who wrote extensively about the accident, described the revelation. They were using the wrong formula. The hydrogen bubble was never a threat. What puzzles me is how many people, not just in the NRC, not just at 3 Mile Island, but people in the industry on the phone as technical consultants who are on site, how many of them dealt with that formula and nobody noticed? By Sunday evening, the crisis was effectively over. The bubble began to dissipate on its own. No one had to do anything to get Vitao out of it. Its disappearance was mysterious, yet welcome. Within days, the reactor was stable. The immediate danger had passed. Harold Denton stayed at 3 Mile Island for 3 weeks. He continued holding press conferences, continued explaining what was happening, continued being the calm voice that 2 million frightened Americans needed to hear. His news conferences were carried live on national television. His face appeared on T-shirts. Several Pennsylvania colleges awarded him honorary degrees. He was profiled in People magazine. He was even satirized on Saturday Night Live. But perhaps the most remarkable thing Harold Denton did came later. In 1980, workers at 3 Mile Island had to vent radioactive krypton gas from the containment building. The gas had been trapped inside since the accident, preventing maintenance crews from entering. The only way to proceed with cleanup was to release it into the atmosphere. The public was terrified. They had heard wildly varied reports about how much radiation they had already received. Now the government was going to deliberately release more? Harold Denton took Lucinda and his children, and while they were venting gas, they had a picnic on the grounds of 3 Mile Island. That's what Dr. Angelique discovered in her research. He took his own family to the plant during the radioactive release to show the public it was safe. That's the kind of man Harold Denton was. Governor Richard Thornburg, who went on to serve as United States Attorney General, never forgot what Denton did for Pennsylvania. Harold Denton was the true hero of the 3 Mile Island nuclear crisis, Thornburg said. His easy manner, apparent candor, and ability to speak plain English as well as nuclear jargon quickly made him the world's most believable expert on the technical situation at TMI. He proved to be a genuine hero with respect to this event. He was a much-needed source of information for those of us who had the ultimate responsibility for the safety of the people in the area and the quality of the environment. The accident at 3 Mile Island changed the nuclear industry forever. 52 American nuclear reactors were cancelled between 1980 and 1984. No new reactors were ordered by utility companies in the United States from 1979 through the mid-1980s. The whole process of approval for new plants by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was significantly slowed for years. The undamaged Unit 1 reactor at 3 Mile Island didn't resume operation until 1985, 6 years offline. The cleanup of Unit 2, the damaged reactor, continued until 1993. 14 years, total cost exceeded $1 billion. Damage to the unit was so severe that it remained permanently unusable. The Khamenei Commission, assembled by President Carter to investigate the disaster, reported that the fundamental problems at 3 Mile Island were people-related problems and not equipment problems, management weakness, inadequate operator training, inattention to human factors, confusing instrumentation. These failures, not mechanical breakdowns, had transformed a manageable incident into a catastrophe. But the accident also forced sweeping reforms. The Institute of Nuclear Power Operations was established just 9 months later, creating an industry self-policing organization dedicated to promoting excellence. Operator training was completely overhauled. Simulators became mandatory. Control rooms were redesigned with human factors in mind. Emergency response plans were strengthened at every nuclear facility in the country. Plant capacity factors, a measure of how efficiently nuclear plants operate, increased from the 50 to 60% range in the 1970s to over 90% by the 2000s. Significant safety events dropped from an average of 0.9 per plant per year in 1989 to 0.01 by 2006. The industry learned. Performance improved dramatically, and Harold Denton was responsible for implementing many of those changes. He continued working at the NRC until 1993. When the Soviet Union's Chernobyl plant exploded in 1986, Denton became the NRC's chief explainer once again, holding daily press conferences as the worst nuclear disaster in history unfolded half a world away. He was among the first American scientists to visit the Chernobyl site. In 2011, at age 75, he traveled to Japan after the Fukushima disaster to share what he had learned. Harold Ray Denton died on February 13th, 2017, at his home in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was 80 years old. The cause was complications from Alzheimer's disease and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. His wife Lucinda, whom he had married in 1959, survived him, along with 3 children. The obituaries called him a hero. The true hero of 3 Mile Island. The man who calmed a nation. But what made Harold Denton a hero wasn't what he did. It was who he was. He was a kid from small-town North Carolina who swept floors to pay for college. A government bureaucrat who made $50,000 a year. A man with no experience in public relations who suddenly became the most watched person in America. He wasn't chosen because he was charismatic or politically connected. He was chosen because he knew nuclear reactors and he happened to be available. And when he arrived at 3 Mile Island, when he found absolute chaos, when his own scientists were screaming at each other about whether Pennsylvania was about to explode, he did something that seems almost impossibly simple. He told the truth. He explained what he knew. He admitted what he didn't know. He delivered bad news honestly and good news without exaggeration. He didn't spin. He didn't deflect. He didn't blame. He just talked to people, like they deserved to understand what was happening. In a crisis defined by lying instruments, inadequate training, corporate denial, and government confusion, Harold Denton was the one person everyone believed. Anti-nuclear activists and nuclear industry executives, Republicans and Democrats, frightened residents and frustrated journalists, they all trusted him because he earned it. The letters people sent him during the crisis tell the story better than any official report. My nights have been spent much more restful knowing you are in command. Words like trust and truth and calm and honest, written by ordinary Americans who were scared for their families and desperate for someone to believe. Harold Denton was that someone. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't even particularly brave in the conventional sense. He was just a competent, honest man who did his job during the worst moment his industry had ever faced. And that was enough. 3 Mile Island taught America that nuclear power wasn't as safe as the industry claimed, that instruments could lie, that operators could be overwhelmed, that accidents previously deemed incredible could happen. But it also taught us something else. That in moments of crisis, the right person matters more than the right technology. That honesty is more powerful than spin. That trust, once lost, can be rebuilt. If someone is willing to earn it back, one truthful statement at a time. Harold Denton earned it. The kid who swept floors. The bureaucrat nobody knew. The man who stood between 2 screaming scientists while the president's helicopter descended and said, "We're going to tell him both calculations." That's how you become a hero. Not by having all the answers, but by telling the truth about the questions.